Carrie Roberts, and I have a background of being a developer. I settled in as a web application developer at one point, and then after about 4 years of that, in 2010, I had my first pen test done on my web application. I actually didn't know the test was happening, and I failed miserably for critical things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting. And that's the first time in 2010 that I had ever even heard those words, let alone knew what they meant. And so after a couple of days of pouting about the fact that I failed that pen test and I know nothing about security, I decided to set off on a journey to learn everything I could about security. And then, of course, learning more about pen tests, realizing I could get paid to break people's apps instead of make mine work. That seemed like a lot more fun. So in 2014, I had the privilege of being a pen tester for Black Hills for 3 years, and then I moved on to full-time red teaming for a couple of years with Walmart, and now a defense engineer on the Walmart blue team. But I still do a lot of coding as part of my job. I do have to say a caveat that I'm presenting here as a Antisyphon instructor. I teach a PowerShell class for them and an attack emulation class. So the views here are my own and don't represent Walmart, but I do work for Walmart. So you can see from some of the bullet points there that I've been seeking to learn everything I can about security. It's been a wonderful journey. So I'm glad to be here today and, actually know a few things about security after that bad day in 2010. Okay, so today we're talking about 10 ways to bypass the history file in PowerShell. The history file meaning a file that keeps track of all the commands that have been run. Really, it's there for convenience for the user to be able to reuse commands that they used before, but it's also interesting from a defense perspective to be able to see what commands were run and to kind of reverse engineer what an attacker might have been up to on the machine during incident response. So that's why it's particularly interesting to attackers to bypass it, but also for defenders to know about it and that it can be bypassed. So in PowerShell, just a quick little bit about PowerShell. PowerShell is a couple things. There's PowerShell, the language, which is an excellent, powerful, wonderful scripting language. But then also it's a command prompt, kind of like command.exe, but much more powerful and handy to use. So sometimes it can be confusing because we think PowerShell is this command prompt, but it's also a language. So here I have on the left, we have an example of running the get history command. So there's two different types of history built into PowerShell when you use the PowerShell command prompt. So get history, it shows you what's in the history that's just in memory. So it's not written to disk anywhere. It's very volatile, meaning it goes away when you close this PowerShell command window or restart the computer. So if we did some commands in this window and ran get history, it would be different than if we started up a new PowerShell command window and ran get history. So we're not talking about that history today, the session history, that volatile one that goes away. We're talking about the one that gets written to disk, the history file. The history file is provided to us in PowerShell through a PowerShell module that's installed by default with PowerShell on Windows and PowerShell Core on Linux and Mac. It's a module called PSReadLine. And so people don't always necessarily realize this, but that module is installed by default, and that's what's giving us this history file. So on the right, we have I'm catting out. So cat is a shortened command for concatenate, which is just show me the contents of this file on the screen, the words of the file. So here I'm saying cat, and I'm asking the readline module to tell me where it's saving the history file. So I say, get the option where you're saving the history file, show me what's in that file. So you see there's like 6 commands there that I'm showing from the history file. So that history file is there after reboot, after a new session start in PowerShell. So it's handy for forensics investigators to look at, to find out what was done. And it's also handy just for your everyday user to be able to reuse common commands that they used recently or yesterday or something, and that is written to disk. So history file history file is the one you may not have realized you were using it, but if you're using PowerShell and you typed a few commands and you want to redo the command you ran last time or the time before, and you use the arrow keys on your keyboard to go through that history and run something, that's actually going through, those arrow keys are going through your file-based history. That one that's more permanent. And you can also use Control R to search through the history. So if you typed in like READ and push Control R, it would bring up the last command you used where you had READ in the command line. And if there were more than one and you weren't looking for that one, you were looking for a previous one, you could keep hitting Control R to go to the next result, next result, next result, or if you accidentally passed it, Control S to search forward through that history. And as we'll talk about in today, that history file can contain sensitive information. If you type in your command line a password or key, it's going to go into that history, or it may go into that history. The history file isn't really your typical go-to centrally logged, keep track of everything that's going on kind of situation. It's more of a from an offensive standpoint, let's not make it super easy to figure out what I've been up to. And from a defensive standpoint, it's just another little nugget that has been successful in revealing some details of an attack. So that brings us to the 10 ways that attackers may try to bypass that for defense evasion, so that it's harder for the defense to find out what they've been up to when they're investigating. So we'll start with number one, which is just the obvious. We could ask our PowerShell session, where are you saving this history? And by default, it's going to be in the users. You see in the pink there, the users app data directory console history.txt. And each PowerShell host, so a host is a thing that allows you to enter PowerShell commands. One PowerShell host is this PowerShell command prompt. There's also another host, the PowerShell ISE, integrated IDE, integrated development environment, integrated scripting environment, ISE, that has a different history file. So there's actually multiple history files. There's, if you use Visual Code and you go into Visual Code's little PowerShell window, it's not this PowerShell command prompt, but it lets you run PowerShell commands. It has even a different history file, which you can get if you do get PSReadLine option. So that's also important to know that you can have multiple history files. So that's bypass method number one. The attacker could do his or her commands, and then just delete the file completely. It makes it a little obvious that somebody's covering their tracks if they do that. So we'll talk about some other ways. So here would be a more stealthy option, is just to edit that history file. So we know where that file is. We can ask the read line option where it's saving the file. And here I have open in Notepad the commands here, and maybe line number 2 here, I want to delete as an attacker. I don't want them to know I did this bad line. So I just erase it and click save. And then down here, after I've clicked save, I'm listing the contents of the history file, and it no longer has line number 2, which I deleted from the file. So it's just a simple file that can be edited. Bypass number 3. So in addition to the PSReadLine option being able to tell you what options it has set for where to save the file, you can use set PSReadLine option to change any of those configurations. So here we're changing where we're saving our history. So normally it's in the app data directory. That's probably where a defender would go look first, expecting it to be in the default location. But if I was an attacker and I was trying to avoid that history file, I could set a different save path. So here I'm saying I'm going to save to the temp directory in a file called erase me, run my commands, and at that point I can close my PowerShell window, and anybody else who opens a new PowerShell window would get the default setting for their history path back and start saving to that old path, the normal path. Or I could force it back to the default path after I'm done running my commands. And then I may or may not go delete that eraseme.txt file to not have a file record of the commands I ran. So that's bypass number 3. Now we're looking at history save style. So one of the configurations for the PSReadLine option lets you say how you want to save. So first is save incrementally. This is the default, which means every time a command is entered in our command prompt, it will write it to the file at that time, versus SaveAtExit, meaning it will save all those commands in memory. And when you close the session, it'll write them all out to the file. Or you can just tell it, I don't want you to save anything. And you may guess that that's one of the bypasses. So let's see. It's bypass number 4, just setting history style with set PSReadLine option to save nothing. So that's pretty clear. We also have SaveAtExit. So when I was coming up with this presentation, I thought, well, let's just set it to SaveAtExit. And then before, after we're done running our attack commands, then we just crash this PowerShell window so it can't do its typical shutdown items like writing the commands to the history file. I think that's a valid idea. But as it turns out, SaveAtExit is broke. And so there's a PowerShell issue open, and it's from 2015, and it's still open, saying that SaveAtExit doesn't work. It acts exactly as SaveAtNothing. So if you set the PowerShell history currently to SaveAtExit, it will act the same way as saving nothing. So in fact, it does work as a history bypass because it does the same thing as telling it to save nothing, but it didn't work exactly how anybody expected it to work. I also want to point out, just from a defensive perspective, let's say that you decide you want to start keeping an eye on who's trying to avoid the history file. Just remember that there's a lot of different ways you can set these values. So here with some of the pink arrows, I'm setting the history save style using an integer. So the history save style is actually an enumeration of values then tied to a number. So actually, if you set the history save style to the number 2, it's the same as setting it to save nothing. So maybe your defense is to look for the word save nothing. So just be aware that there's some creative ways to set that. And in the green, I also show history save style. We're doing some math. So the $sign means execute this math before using it. So that's the same as saying history save style is 2, which is same as save nothing. And here's even some more creative ways of using not an integer at all, but casting a value like false to an integer. So just something to keep in mind if you're trying to keep an eye on this. Oh, and the second green option here is in PowerShell, you only have to specify this is a command flag for what we want to set. You only have to specify enough of the flag so that it's unique. So there's actually 2 flags that this set PSReadLine option supports that starts with history save. It's the history save path and history save style. So in order for it to know which one you're wanting to use, you have to at least do history save and then either P or S. P would give you the path, S. So we can set the history save style with just part of the flag. And even if this flag was more unique, it was the only one that started with H, we could set it with just -H. So that's something to keep in mind for future detections. Bypass number 6, we could set the maximum history count, which sets the number of commands to save in our history. So I would read that to mean that our history file would only contain whatever we set it to, 0 or 1. It actually doesn't let you set it to 0, so maybe we set it to 1, thinking that that would keep our history file with only 1 line in it, which isn't actually how it works. It just makes it so we can only access 1 item from the history from our PowerShell window. It doesn't actually erase the history file and get it back down to 1 line like it sounds like to me and like I expected. So that actually doesn't work. So we can't count that as bypass number 6. We'll go on and do a different bypass number 6. So one of the options within the PSReadLine is to set a custom history handler, which that is some code. You can tell, I want you to run this code to decide whether to put each command in the history file. So you can give it this little code block. It will give your code block the command line. You can look at that command line and say, yes, I want it to be written to the history, or no, I don't. So return true or false. So here's a very simple custom history handler to avoid writing anything at all to the history file. So here I say set PSReadLine option, add to history handler, and inside the squiggly braces is my function that I want it to run to decide. And I just always return false. So it doesn't matter what command line somebody enters, it's going to ask my function, should I put this in the log? And I just always say, no, 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 no. So that's bypass number 6. Bypass number 7, PowerShell has something that it supports called language modes. So by default, it's in full language mode. It also has some other language modes, including constrained language mode and no language mode. So if you're in constrained language mode, some things don't run because they're constrained, and one of those things is the logging module. So here I'm setting an environment variable to say that I'm in constrained language mode. This is actually not the correct way to set it if you were a defender trying to enforce constrained language mode, but it is a way to get it into constrained language mode. And so here I've set that environment variable, but that environment variable doesn't take effect until, it gets read at the time you start the PowerShell window. So here on the second line, I'm asking, what's my language mode? I'm still in full language mode. So in order to have this environment variable take effect, I type PowerShell to get, it's really PowerShell inside of PowerShell, but it causes that environment variable to read. And now here where I ask it my language mode, it just says constrained language mode. And we can see things aren't working with the read line option here. Option number 8, we could just use a script. So that's really easy. So here we've got a script called script.ps1. Scripts are just a text file with a PS1 extension. So we can put our commands. We have 3 commands here doing some stuff. We put it in the file. So here, the first pink arrow, we run the script with a / and the name of the script. It does our stuff. It writes this stuff to the screen like we've asked it to do. But if we then cat out what's in our history file, the only command that we ran in this command prompt is the /script.ps1. So we don't see any details of the script. It doesn't log the script. It logs the fact that we entered a command to run the script, and that's it. So that's a very straightforward way to avoid the history file with commands. Bypass number 9, it's pretty bold, but we could uninstall the PSReadLine module. It's a little bit tricky to do from PowerShell, because when you're in PowerShell, the module's in use and it complains and won't let you uninstall it. But you can use PowerShell to kill PowerShell so that that module's not in use, and then the operating system will let you delete it, which you can just go into your program files modules directory and delete that PSReadLine folder, and that's essentially uninstalling it. And that would definitely stop things from getting to the history file. So because one of my options didn't count that we went through, option number 6, and now I'm forgetting what that was. Oh, the max history. I decided to throw this 10th option in because nobody just wants 9 ways to do something. Everybody wants 10 ways. So here, I make note that there are some different versions of PowerShell. So there's Windows PowerShell, which is what most people are probably really familiar with for over the years. It comes installed on Windows by default right now, is Windows PowerShell. And that's the version 5. There's also PowerShell Core, which is the newer, it's version 6 and up, but right now they're on version 7 something. PowerShell Core is cross-platform. You can run it on Windows, Linux, and Mac. You can install it side by side with Windows PowerShell. So here on the screen, actually, I have a VM running both Windows PowerShell and PowerShell Core. So PowerShell Core defaults to a black background. So you can see that on the right is PowerShell Core running on the same system. So Windows PowerShell ships by default with PSReadLine version 2.0 install. But PowerShell Core comes with PSReadLine greater version 2.0.4 or higher. In this case, I was on 2.2 5 that came installed when I installed PowerShell for a couple of weeks ago. So there's an important difference between these PSReadLine versions. 2.04 and up has a feature called sensitive command line scrubbing, where if it sees any of these keywords, password, as plain text, token, API key, or secret on the command line anywhere, it won't write that line to the history file. So this is trying to help keep sensitive data out of the history file. So as a normal user, if we end up needing to type a password on the command line, we don't really want that sitting around for a long time in a history file, that if an attacker did get access, they could just look through the history file and look for sensitive stuff. So you can see a benefit there, but at the same time, it does give us an easy option for avoiding the history file. So I have some demos recorded here, which I guess I have to push the play button here. So here we're writing host, we're doing bad stuff, and then we're going to write host, but this time we're going to do bad stuff and hide it. And the way we hide it is we're putting actually a comment, a hashtag is a comment, but it doesn't matter. We put a comment of token. That's one of the keywords for scrubbing. So it's because that line has the word token anywhere, somewhere, even in a comment, when we list out the history file, we see write host do bad stuff having been a command we run, but we don't see the write host where we hit it because we had that keyword that gets it scrubbed from the history. So that's another easy way to keep out. This is another example of, well, let's see, another example where I'm not using a comment. I'm using the word password. It's actually a variable, and PowerShell variables start with a $sign. So I'm just saying $password equals. So that's also going to keep it out of the history file because for the same reason, the scrubbing when it sees the word password. So, pros and cons for that, but it is a magic word that keeps lines out of the history file. So that does it. We saw 10 ways that we can keep stuff out of the history file for good or for bad. But as defenders, it's important to know that the history file isn't super reliable, and we definitely want to be using things like our PowerShell logging options, which don't have all these different workarounds. And if you want to learn more about these types of things, including going into all the details about PowerShell, language modes, and secure administration, remote, PowerShell remoting, and all those kind of related things, check out my PowerShell for Infosec class. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks for watching. Achieve your next level of skills with training courses at Antisyphontraining.com.